World News Today, brought to you by Admiral Corporation, world's largest manufacturer of radio phonographs with automatic record changers. This program is presented in behalf of Admiral dealers all over America. By shortwave broadcast direct from important overseas stations and leading news centers in our own country, CBS reporters are waiting to bring you first-hand news from the world's political and battlefronts. Now, here's Bob Trout.
Front reports from Germany tell us that British troops of the Second Army are now within 7 miles of two important German cities, the river port of Bremen and farther inland, the city of Hanover. Bremen, according to one report, is now under British artillery fire. Allied airborne troops dropped over a wide area of northeastern Holland ahead of the British-Canadian First Army, which is meeting heavy resistance in the drive to cut off Holland from Germany. There are no reports yet of a link-up between First Army troops and the airborne, but the First Army did capture Zutphen, the Dutch communications center on the IJssel River. More than 1,200 American heavy bombers attacked rail yards and airfields today in central Germany. The Germans are fighting fiercely in the streets of Vienna, but the Russian troops are steadily closing in. In the Pacific, the B-29s have returned to Japan with an attack by substantial forces on Kanoya on the southern tip of the enemy homeland. And an Army spokesman aboard the Admiral's flagship off Okinawa predicted heavier and heavier fighting on the southern front of that island. Our first overseas point today is France. Admiral takes you to CBS Paris. Bill Slocum, Jr. reporting.
Probably the biggest news out of this area tonight is the strong British thrust at the great German port of Bremen. At last reports, British armor fighting under Montgomery were within 8 miles of the second port of Germany. However, that report is several hours old, and when an armored outfit is on the move in high, it very often doesn't waste any time making reports. So possibly there is action in Bremen right now. There were earlier reports of German evacuation from Bremen. The fighting in Europe goes well and slowly. In the Ruhr pocket, Americans grind their way into the core of German resistance. This resistance, by the way, is of a very high caliber. From April 1st to 6th, a total of 189,611 German prisoners were marched into our prison pens here, and approximately another 25,000 were killed or wounded. No army can lose 200,000 men a week for very long. As Allied planes work over sensitive German targets, As Allied planes work over sensitive German targets, the Luftwaffe is showing signs of resistance, but it remains fairly feeble. Yesterday, German pilots did their stuff with their radio earphones humming with a startling mixture of sound instruction and good old do or die for dear old Rutgers pep talks. Ground communications carried the normal ground to pilot messages, plus soul-lifting snatches of Horst Wessel and Deutschland über alles, plus brief verbal exhortations to the pilot to get in there and die for dear old Hitler. A great many of them made it. We may not have the Germany in hand as yet, but we certainly have a large portion of her bankroll. As you know, we captured a salt mine yesterday, which was a treasure house including 100 tons of gold bullion, 3 billion marks, $2 million, 100 million French francs, 110,000 pounds sterling, and so on and on and on. Today it was announced that an almost countless treasure of statues, pictures, tapestries, and other art treasures were also found in the mine. It was also announced that as yet, no American soldiers had seen the gold or the dollars. This is Bill Slocum, Jr. at Supreme Allied Headquarters, Paris. I return you now to Admiral in New York.
The American First Army moved tanks over 4 Weser River crossings today. For a direct report from this battle zone, Admiral takes you to Germany. Richard C. Hottelet reporting.
The First U.S. Army is on the move again and racing eastward. Infantry stormed across the Weser River and this morning drove on 13 miles to take the university town of Göttingen. Here, they captured a bridge across the Leine River, and this afternoon, the doughboys were moving ahead beyond it. This is a breakthrough, the inevitable breakthrough. Only slight resistance along the way. When they got plenty of Germans, 15,000 Germans lying wounded in military hospitals. situation. That's just about what we'll meet as we keep on driving east. There's no indication of any organized German troops ahead until we hit the Russian front, now only 188 miles away. You'll notice that the rapid advance this morning was an infantry advance. I've just come back from that area, and the terrain up there explains our tactics. In this thickly wooded, hilly country, it's been an infantry job to clean out the forests, get across the rivers. Tanks are too vulnerable. So the infantry was sent ahead to sweep aside the thin crust of resistance the Germans had built up and to secure the roads against ambush. It was like jabbing in a hypodermic needle through which our armor and our swift motorized units can be squirted through. Right now, the infantry is about on the edge of the difficult country. Ahead of us lies open, rolling ground. It's the Thuringian Basin, an excellent avenue into the heart of Germany and fine country for tanks. The weather has been clear and sunny again today. Our fighter bombers have been able to sweep out and pound targets ahead of us. Remember the part the Air Force boys have played. Remember the part the infantry has played when the headlines are again monopolized by our armored spearheads. This is Richard C. Hottelup with the 1st U.S. Army, returning you to Admiral in New York.
And now here's Warren Sweeney with a word from Admiral.
And now you're going to hear how to preserve. Today we want to satisfy the curiosity of a lady listener. She wrote a letter to Admiral Corporation a few days ago, which read as follows.
I am a regular listener to your Admiral World News Today program, and I'm certainly intrigued with the idea of owning an Admiral refrigerator that won't have to be defrosted. But I'm puzzled. You say there are no coils or ice cube compartment to defrost. What do you do about ice cubes? Can't you freeze ice cubes in the Admiral Dual Temp?
I'll say you can freeze ice cubes in the Admiral Dual Temp. Hundreds of them, all at once. The freezing locker in the Dual Temp has a freezing temperature as low as 5 degrees below zero. If you're having a party and need a lot of ice cubes, you can freeze nearly 2 bushels of them. Then, because of the dry cold in the Admiral Dual Temp freezing locker, you can store them as long as you like, and they won't even stick together. You see, the Admiral Dual Temp is really 2 refrigerators in one. Besides the freezing locker, there's the huge purified moist cold compartment with a temperature of 38 degrees and 85% humidity, and it never needs to be defrosted. Here, foods will stay fresh and appetizing without covered dishes. The Admiral Dual Temp is the answer to all of tomorrow's home refrigeration problems. Dual Temp is the successor to the ordinary mechanical refrigerator. And remember, only Admiral can build a Dual Temp. Now here once again is Bob Trout.
The British people once again have watched large forces of heavy bombers bound for Germany. For this and for other news, Admiral takes you to CBS London. Douglas Edwards reporting.
The American 8th Air Force was out in very great strength today. 1,200 fortresses and liberators, accompanied by 750 fighters, attacked rail yards, airfields, ordnance depots, an oil storage center, and a repair factory for jet-propelled planes. The targets were in central Germany, west of Berlin, south to Nuremberg. 10 bombers and 1 fighter were lost in the operation. Well, now that the Weser River has been reached and crossed, military observers here in London look toward the Elbe, the only river obstacle on the northern part of the front. The question is, does Kesselring intend to make a serious stand on the Elbe line, and can he do it, even if those are his intentions? Well, the people I've talked to doubt very seriously if the disorganized remnants of the beaten German armies of the north will be in any shape to hold the Elbe, and they think it probably can be crossed as easily as the Weser was. Then there's the possibility that the Elbe is to be the boundary on which the Allies are to join hands with the Russians. Only in that case would it call a halt to the advance to the east. With the Ninth Army, the British, the American First and Third Armies all rolling toward the heart of Germany, their objective very clearly would seem to be to meet the Russians. And it doesn't make much difference who does it first. There's a story today concerning Hitler's former deputy, the ill-fated traveler, Rudolf Hess. He's reported to be miserable because of the turn the war has taken so swiftly, and about all he does now is listen to the radio and read newspaper war reports in the living room of his prison quarters. So violently did he react to the news a short time ago, we're told, that he became a victim of advanced melancholia. Hess probably knows better than anybody outside of Germany what Hitler and company intend to do when final defeat comes, but so far he's kept that knowledge to himself. And the story goes that there is no sign that he realizes he may have to face trial as a war criminal. During the past few days, there's been a steady increase in the British press and radio and the amount of news on the Pacific War. Big play was given today of the latest American victories over the Jap fleet, and somebody expressed the opinion that so far as Britain is concerned, the West Front War is practically a thing of the past, aside from some victory celebration at a vague future date. There may be a lifting of dim-out regulations, but rationing will continue just as is in foods and clothing. Other wartime rules will apply, production must continue, and almost all of the men in service, or a great part of them, will continue at that job until Japan goes down. The British have not lost their stride. This is Douglas Edwards in London, and now back to Admiral in New York.
And now for a discussion of the military situation in Russia, here's Columbia's military analyst, Major George Fielding Elliott.
The Russian armies have virtually completed the encirclement of Vienna. They are reported breaking into the suburbs of the city. Marshal Tolbukin's purpose appears to be to rush this operation in the hope of preventing the Germans from carrying out house-to-house resistance, which would entail the destruction of one of the most beautiful of Europe's great historic cities. Perhaps Tolbukin will be able to do this and to liberate Vienna as Paris and Brussels were liberated without grave damage. Or perhaps the fate of Vienna will be that of Budapest and Warsaw. It is too early to tell what scale of resistance the German garrison may be able to put up, but it is ominous to note that SS troops are reported among that garrison. We should further consider that the fall of Vienna would open to the Russians the eastern entrance of the Danube Gateway through the mountain region of Central Europe, where the Nazis are proposing to make their last stand. In view of the fact that the troops of General Jacob L. Dever's 6th Army Group are pushing steadily toward the upper Danube in Bavaria, it is obvious that one of the great anxieties of the Nazi leaders must be a possible future junction between Devers and Tolbukin along the course of the Danube, thus cutting the mountain stronghold in two and bringing Allied forces within easy striking distance of the central citadel at Berchtesgaden. Hence, it is altogether in the cards that Vienna may be defended by the Germans to the last gasp, for the same reason that German resistance is stiffening before Devers' advancing columns in the west. During the week, another notable Russian achievement has been the advance through the High Tatras toward the eastern margin of the Moravian Gap, carried out by the 4th Ukrainian Army Group, now commanded by General Yeremenko, one of Russia's ablest field commanders. This probably foreshadows a linking up of the Russian armies in southeastern Germany and those in Austria by way of the Moravian Gap, one of Russia's ablest field commanders. This probably foreshadows a linking up of the Russian armies in southeastern Germany and those in Austria by way of the Moravian Gap. This would result in an immense shortening of the Russian front, in the consequent release of considerable numbers of Russian troops for other employment, and in the loss to the Germans of one of their most important industrial regions around Moravska Ostrava. It would also prepare the way for a Russian advance farther north, directed toward Berlin and Dresden, though this move is, in the view of many observers, likely to take place even before the situation in the Moravian Gap has been cleaned up. Now here again is Bob Trout.
And now for the news developments and major problems on the home front. Admiral takes you to CBS Washington. Tris Coffin reporting.
The decaying smell of the slow death of Germany is very strong in Washington. It is affecting the thinking and action in the nation's capital. Plans for reconversion are being speeded up, and within the next several weeks, the administration will ask Congress for definite policy guidance on such matters as price control, employment practices, small business, and civilian production. President Roosevelt's program is fairly clear. He wants the controls held on until we have completed the job of reconverting our vast war plant and employment is stabilized. The time when all controls will be lifted is far in the distance, sometime after Japan is conquered. This policy has been forming for not until this morning that it came out into the open. The White House released a letter to the President from Economic Stabilization Director Davis, OPA Chief Bowles, War Food Administrator Jones, and Chairman Taylor of the War Labor Board. The gist of the letter is that controls are necessary to prevent a seesaw of inflation and deflation following the defeat of Germany. These executives foresee prices and wages sagging down some after VE Day. Then, they told the President, they will start climbing up again, unless there is some check. The Reconstruction Finance Corporation announced today a program to aid small business in the difficult reconversion period. This agency will guarantee up to 75% of bank loans for small business in the post-war transition, Or, if the banks will not loan funds, RFC is prepared to put up the money itself. It is significant that the man most discussed for the RFC chairman is Harold Smith, now the efficient director of the budget. He is one of the greatest champions of small business in Washington and has worked closely with the Senate Small Business Committee. The most important announcement on reconversion is due for release possibly next week. The Army Service Forces, which buys the bulk of the war goods manufactured in America, is preparing a statement on its cutbacks. The signs are that there will be no big drop all at once, but a gradual reconversion and shift in production. Perhaps, say, a 25% cutback on war production beginning VE Day. Much of this slack will be taken up by needs of liberated Europe for machinery. The approaching end of the European war is indicated, too, by a renewed drive for the merger of the Army and Navy. Secretary of War Stimson made public today a letter putting the War Department squarely behind the proposed single department of the armed forces. He recommended the Senate action on this proposal. The Navy has been decidedly cool toward this merger, feeling it and the Marine Corps would be smothered by Army domination. Secretary Stimson said flatly, "We ought to have all of our Army, Navy, and Marine activities coordinated." Another sign that the end of Europe is in sight is the series of announcements by the State Department on the control of Germany. The latest is the revelation that Himmler and Goering both have agents scouting the world to raise money for Nazi post-war activities. The end of the war against Japan is also coming in for a lot of unofficial speculation. Russia's announcement that the Soviet-Japanese neutrality pact is meaningless gave rise to hopes that this war may end sooner than expected. But sober official judgment in Washington today is that Russia will not fight Japan until our forces are set to invade the home islands. The main role of Moscow now, according to these sources, is to hold down the tough Jap army in Manchuria by threat of attack. Official sources also indicate the Russian price may be to allow Manchuria to vote on becoming an autonomous Soviet republic. This area is now claimed by China. I return you to Bob Trout and Admiral in New York.
We have word from Rome today that American-born Japanese of the crack 442nd United States Infantry Regiment have captured Mount Belvedere, the 3,000-foot peak 2 miles east of Massa, and they've also secured Carrara Ridge in a continuing drive toward La Spezia. This Nisi regiment hacked along the twisting roads that wind through the mountains of the famous Carrara marble quarries to within less than 19 miles of La Spezia. The Germans hurled heavy artillery and mortar fire from dominating heights along the coastal ridge in an effort to check the drive. Correspondents in Italy say the capture of Mount Belvedere paves the way for a two-pronged assault on Massa, which is a provincial capital with an estimated population of more than 20,000 people. A second Fifth Army column has met stubborn resistance 2 miles south of the city, which is the last major strong point before La Spezia. The Allied command revealed today that the hard-fighting Nisi had re-entered combat after serving with the Fifth Army from Naples to the Arno. It was this regiment which stormed and captured Mount Fragalito, 3 miles southeast of Massa, in the opening phase of Lieutenant General Truscott's spring offensive. Altogether, the first week of April has been one of the worst the Axis has ever lived through. In the Pacific, the new Japanese government came into being just as the factories in the Tokyo suburbs were being bombed by super fortresses, escorted by American land-based fighter planes, making their first ominous appearance over Japan. On the same day, the Japanese Navy lost the major part of the task force it had sent into the East China Sea to combat the great Allied fleet supporting the invasion of Okinawa. And perhaps even more significant, on the previous day, the Japanese lost 294 planes in a great aerial attack on the Allied warships. The enemy planes did cause damage. They sank 3 American destroyers, and they damaged others. But in the 2-day engagement, the enemy paid a much higher price than he exacted. Japan's new premier, Baron Suzuki, says that he's moved into deepest humiliation and regret at the developments and neglect that have allowed the Allies to secure a firm foothold on portions of the sacred Japanese Empire. And Premier Suzuki has now added his warning to the other official forecasts that have recently been directed to the Japanese people, warning that the Japanese homeland may soon be invaded. And the week's great news from Moscow, where the Neutrality Pact was denounced by the Russian government, means that Japan's powerful armies on the Asiatic mainland are more severely threatened than ever before. frequently, there have been predictions by observers here at home that the Japanese armies on the continent of Asia would prove to be a more serious problem than the Japanese homeland itself. Such gloomy predictions are not likely to be heard very often from now on. In Europe, with each passing day, the British and American armies pushed deeper into Germany, and it became increasingly plain that General Eisenhower was actually being very cautious when he suggested, near the end of March last month, that the German High Command might never again be able to form a continuous north-south line to oppose the Allied forces. By now, that possibility is practically accepted as a fact, for the Germans have little time and less room in which to reestablish their Western Front. Already, the Allied spearheads are approaching territory which the Germans considered to be part of the rear areas of their Eastern Front. And if the rapid advances, which have already cut to pieces the German communication and supply areas for the Western Front, continue at the present rate, the Allied armies of the West will soon be cutting up the German communication and supply lines that lead to the Eastern Front. No one can say at what point the Russian armies on the Oder, so close to Berlin, will start their final drive. The date may depend on several things. Perhaps it's been set already in advance to synchronize with a certain stage of the advance of the Allies from the West. Or perhaps the Russians have not yet built up the strength necessary for a huge attack along the Oder. Or the Russians may wish to carry even farther forward their preliminary drive in the southeast, which is now swiftly cutting off Vienna with a trap that's within 40 miles of closing completely around the city. Steadily, the Russians in Austria are approaching the mountain area in which the German government leaders are supposed to be planning their last stand. There's still some ground for the belief that the Germans may also intend to hold out in a northern pocket. The Norwegian government in London says the Germans are bringing heavy guns and other war material into Norway, improving their airfields and increasing the number of fortified U-boat pens, seizing ever larger numbers of Norwegian civilians to be taken to the German torture camps. The Norwegian government calls upon Sweden to abandon its neutrality and help rescue what can be saved of Norway. In this somber fashion, Norway acknowledges the approach of a tragic anniversary, the German invasion, which began 5 years ago tonight with simultaneous attacks on Norway and Denmark. It was the beginning of the terrible spring when Germany smashed all Western Europe, belligerent and neutral alike. Now the series of melancholy anniversaries is coming round again. Another spring, the last one in the brutal circle of German conquest and German defeat. And now you're going to hear how to preserve the life of your favorite music on records. Here's Warren Sweeney.
If you want your precious records to last longer, you'd better take a look at the new Admiral radio phonographs just as soon as the war is won. Admiral Corporation is the world's largest manufacturer of radio phonographs with automatic record changers. But about your records. The new feather-light tone arm on the Admiral will exert so little pressure and cause so little wear that your records will last much longer, and there won't be any surface noises. The Admiral radio phonograph is the one with slide away. Admiral Slide Away is the exclusive Admiral feature that brings the complete phonograph turntable and automatic record changer right out in plain view, simply by opening the cabinet doors. Admiral Slide Away is another reason why your records will last longer. You eliminate the chance of chipping or breaking them when you load or unload the Admiral automatic record changer because you can see what you're doing. So, to get the best of everything for your listening pleasure, plus safeguarding your precious records, make your post-war radio phonograph an Admiral, America's smart set. This year, there will be only 2 war bond drives rather than 3 as last year. But just as much money, regardless of what happens in Europe, will be needed. So it's up to every American to lend just as much as before. When the 7th war loan starts on May 14th, let's each of us buy a bigger share of extra war bonds than ever before. World News Today is brought to you each Sunday at this hour by Admiral Corporation, makers of Admiral Radio, America's smart set, and post-war makers of Admiral dual-temp refrigerators, Admiral home freezers, Admiral electric ranges. Be sure to listen again next Sunday when Admiral brings you World News Today by shortwave, direct from leading news centers of the world. This is